Welcome to Dark Night Tales. In 1869, whispers spread across the American South about a towering African hunter boy named Jabari, a figure so powerful, so mysterious, that entire towns claimed to live in fear of him. Tonight, we unravel the truth behind the legend, separating documented history from the shadows of myth through intense, fact-based research and forgotten records that took countless hours to uncover. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you value deeply researched, true dark history that mainstream stories ignore. Subscribe now, because stories like this deserve to be remembered, not buried. The earliest accounts of Jabari begin in the unsettled years following the Civil War, around 1869, when the American South was still fractured, fearful, and deeply unstable. Freed black communities were forming their own paths. Former Confederate states were under Reconstruction, and white Southern society was haunted by the loss of absolute control it once held. It was within this climate of tension and paranoia that rumors of a giant African hunter boy began circulating across rural counties, whispered first in plantation fields, and then shouted in taverns, churches, and town halls. According to scattered newspaper notices and oral accounts passed down through generations, Jabari was first seen near wooded borderlands, areas where swamps, forests, and abandoned plantations merged into lawless terrain. Witnesses described a towering black youth, far larger than the average man, moving silently through the trees with the confidence of someone raised to hunt rather than hide. Some claimed he carried handmade weapons, while others insisted he needed none, saying his strength alone was enough to overpower animals and men. What terrified local residents most was not violence, but unpredictability. Jabari was said to appear without warning, watching from a distance before vanishing just as quickly. He was spotted near livestock pens, riverbanks, and old slave routes, places loaded with symbolic fear for a society still traumatized by rebellion and emancipation. Each sighting added another layer of exaggeration. His height grew taller, his silence more ominous, his presence more threatening. White landowners quickly framed Jabari as a menace, a living embodiment of their worst fears. A black figure who could not be controlled, owned, or intimidated. In contrast, some formerly enslaved people viewed him differently. Quietly, away from white ears, he was spoken of as a protector, a watcher, or even a warning spirit, someone who understood the land better than those who claimed to own it. These first sightings were the spark that ignited the legend. Whether Jabari was a real individual, a misunderstood traveler, or a figure amplified by racial hysteria, one truth is undeniable: by the end of 1869, fear had already transformed him from a boy into a monster in the Southern imagination. And once that transformation began, there was no stopping it. As fear spread with each reported sighting, curiosity quickly followed, and the South began inventing a past for Jabari that felt just as threatening as his presence. Rumors claimed he was not born in America at all, but brought directly from Africa, already grown, already trained, and already dangerous. In a region obsessed with racial hierarchy, this detail mattered deeply. To many white Southerners in 1869, Africa was not a place of culture or civilization. It was portrayed as a wilderness, and labeling Jabari as African-born made him easier to fear and dehumanize. Stories circulated that Jabari came from a lineage of elite hunters, raised among tribes where tracking, survival, and combat were learned before reading or speech. Some claimed he was trained to hunt lions and elephants, able to survive days without food, and capable of disappearing into forests without leaving a trace. These tales grew darker with every retelling, turning a boy into something almost supernatural, half human, half predator. Newspapers of the era often fueled these myths using coded language. Phrases like foreign Negro, savage bred, or untamed stock appeared in print not as facts, but as fear-driven assumptions. There was rarely evidence, only suggestion. No ship records confirmed his arrival. No owner claimed to have purchased him. Yet the absence of proof only strengthened the legend. If Jabari had no paper trail, people assumed it was because he had slipped through systems meant to control him. Among black communities, however, the narrative shifted. Elders spoke of African knowledge with respect, not fear. Being called a hunter did not mean bloodlust. It meant discipline, patience, and deep understanding of nature. Some whispered that Jabari carried ancestral skills passed down through generations, skills that slavery had tried and failed to erase. To them, the rumors of Africa were not an accusation, but a source of power. In reality, these stories reveal less about Jabari and more about the South itself. The idea of an African-born hunter terrified a society that depended on the myth of black inferiority. If Jabari truly possessed knowledge older and stronger than their laws, then he represented something far more dangerous than violence. He represented freedom beyond their understanding. Thus, the rumors of his African origins became the foundation of the legend. Whether true or fabricated, they transformed Jabari from a mysterious figure into a symbol of untamed strength, forcing the South to confront fears it could neither explain nor control. Every legend needs an image, and in Jabari's case, physical descriptions became the most powerful fuel for both terror and obsession. As word of his sightings spread across the South, descriptions of his body grew more exaggerated with each retelling, shaped not by truth alone, but by racial fear and post-war hysteria. What began as accounts of a tall, broad-shouldered boy soon evolved into stories of a figure that seemed almost inhuman in size and presence. Witnesses claimed Jabari stood far taller than most men of the era, with immense shoulders, long arms, and a posture described as unnaturally still. Some said his muscles appeared carved rather than trained, as if strength was not learned but inherited. Others insisted his movements were silent, no snapping twigs, no rustling leaves, an unsettling detail in a region where even seasoned hunters made noise in dense woods. This silence unnerved people more than brute force ever could. His eyes became a focal point of fear. Newspapers and oral accounts often described them as watchful, piercing, or unnervingly calm, unlike the expected image of a frightened runaway or aggressive criminal. Jabari was portrayed as controlled, observant, and unflinching. That calmness frightened witnesses because it suggested intention. He wasn't reacting, he was assessing. Clothing also played a role in the myth. Jabari was reportedly seen wearing minimal garments, sometimes animal hides or torn cloth, reinforcing the idea that he lived outside civilization. To white Southerners, desperate to reassert social order, this appearance confirmed their worst beliefs, that he was wild, lawless, and beyond authority. Yet for others, especially the formerly enslaved, his appearance symbolized rejection of bondage and ownership, a body no longer dressed to serve. Over time, the physical descriptions stopped being human measurements and became symbolic ones. Jabari wasn't just tall, he loomed. He didn't walk, he stalked. He didn't look, he judged. Fear transformed his body into a message. This was not someone to be chased, captured, or commanded. In truth, these descriptions reveal how the South projected its anxieties onto a single figure. Jabari's body became a canvas onto which society painted its guilt, fear, and loss of control. Whether he was truly a giant or simply a strong, self-possessed youth, the legend of his physical presence ensured one thing. Long before anyone claimed he attacked, People were already afraid to stand in his shadow. To understand why Jabari's story ignited such intense fear, you must understand America in 1869, a nation technically freed from slavery, yet psychologically addicted to it. The Civil War had ended only 4 years earlier, and the South was still reeling from defeat, humiliation, and the collapse of a racial system that had governed every aspect of life for generations. Freedom had been declared, but equality was treated as a threat. Reconstruction was underway, bringing federal troops, new laws, and the promise of black citizenship. Formerly enslaved people were voting, owning land, and demanding wages. To white Southern society, especially former slaveholders, this shift felt like chaos. The fear was not just economic, it was existential. They had built their identity on dominance, and suddenly, that dominance was slipping away. In this environment, any black figure who appeared independent, powerful, or uncontrollable became a symbol of rebellion. Jabari did not need to commit violence to be seen as dangerous. His size, silence, and freedom of movement alone challenged the fragile illusion that white authority still ruled the land. He represented what the South feared most: a black man who did not ask permission to exist. Racist propaganda filled newspapers, sermons, and political speeches. Black men were routinely portrayed as brutes, predators, or savages, images deliberately designed to justify new forms of control. These narratives laid the groundwork for vigilante justice, convict leasing, and the early rise of white supremacist terror groups. Jabari's legend fit perfectly into this manufactured fear, whether he intended it or not. For black communities, the climate was equally dangerous, but in a different way. Freedom came with violence. Lynching, intimidation, and false accusations were becoming tools to reassert racial hierarchy. Simply being accused could be a death sentence. In this reality, Jabari's elusiveness was not criminal, it was survival. The racial climate of 1869 transformed Jabari from a person into a projection. He became a walking reminder that the old order was broken and could not be repaired without brutality. His existence exposed a truth South refused to accept. Slavery was gone, and no amount of fear could bring it back. That is why the story spread so fast and so wildly. Jabari wasn't just a mystery. He was a mirror, reflecting a nation terrified of what freedom actually meant. When rumors of Jabari reached plantation owners, fear quickly turned into outrage. These men, once unquestioned rulers of vast land and labor, were already struggling to accept a new reality where they no longer owned people. The idea of a powerful, unclaimed black youth moving freely through Southern territory struck at the very heart of their wounded authority. To them, Jabari was not just a mystery, he was an insult. Plantation owners interpreted Jabari's presence as a direct challenge to their control over land and labor. Fields that once echoed with forced obedience were now spaces where a black figure could appear without permission. Some claimed livestock had gone missing or tools were disturbed, though evidence was rarely produced. Accusations replaced facts, and suspicion became proof. In private meetings and public complaints, Jabari was labeled a trespasser, a thief, and eventually a threat. Many owners demanded action from local lawmen, insisting posses be formed to restore order. Yet these demands revealed their insecurity. Law enforcement during Reconstruction was inconsistent, and federal oversight limited the power of local elites. When officials hesitated or required evidence, plantation owners saw it as another betrayal, proof that the old system no longer served them. In response, some landowners took matters into their own hands. Armed patrols began riding at night, questioning freedmen, searching cabins, and interrogating anyone suspected of knowing Jabari's whereabouts. These actions had less to do with capturing one boy and more to do with sending a message freedom would still be punished if it appeared too bold. Yet there was a deeper fear beneath their anger. Jabari symbolized something plantation owners could not tolerate, a black person who owed them nothing. He wasn't a laborer seeking work, a tenant asking permission, or a former slave tied to a contract. He was unregistered, undocumented, and unreachable by debt or threat. That kind of freedom was more terrifying than rebellion. Ironically, the louder plantation owners complained, the larger Jabari's legend grew. Their panic validated the myth they were trying to suppress. By reacting with fear instead of facts, they turned a shadow in the woods into a symbol of lost power, one that haunted them long after Jabari himself vanished. In 1869, newspapers were not neutral record keepers. They were weapons of influence, shaping public fear as much as reporting events. When Jabari's name, or descriptions clearly meant to identify him, began appearing in print, facts quickly gave way to exaggeration. Editors understood their audience, and they knew fear sold papers, especially in a South desperate for justification to reclaim control. Rather than outright lies, newspapers relied on coded language, phrases designed to imply danger without needing evidence. Jabari was described as unusual, foreign, unnaturally large, or not of local stock. These words carried heavy racial meaning. To white readers, they suggested savagery, criminality, and moral threat, even when no crime was named. The absence of specific accusations allowed imagination to do the rest. Details grew more dramatic with every column. Reports hinted that Jabari could overpower multiple men, outrun horses, or survive conditions that would kill others. None of these claims were verified, yet they were repeated across counties, giving the illusion of widespread confirmation. One paper would reference another, creating a loop where rumor became fact, simply through repetition. Notably, Jabari was rarely allowed a voice. He was never quoted, interviewed, or humanized. Instead, he existed only through the fearful descriptions of others. This was intentional. Granting him humanity would complicate the narrative, and newspapers of the era thrived on simplicity. Black figure equals danger. At the same time, the language used was careful enough to avoid legal responsibility. Editors often framed stories as, reports say, locals claim, or it is believed. This shielded them from accountability while still igniting panic. In this way, the press became a silent accomplice in spreading hysteria. For black readers, when they could access these papers, the exaggerations were read differently. Between the lines, many recognized the pattern. Whenever a black person stepped outside assigned boundaries, the press transformed them into a monster. Jabari's story wasn't unique, it was amplified. By the end of 1869, newspapers had done what armed men could not. They turned Jabari into a regional legend, ensuring that even those who never saw him were already afraid. Ink, not bullets, made him infamous, and once printed, the myth could never be fully erased. As panic intensified and newspaper stories multiplied, local authorities and white citizens claimed that armed posses were organized to capture Jabari. These groups were often described as necessary measures to protect the community, but in reality, they reflected how quickly fear could turn into sanctioned violence during Reconstruction-era America. According to second-hand reports, posses were formed after supposed sightings near plantations, river crossings, and forested escape routes. Men armed with rifles, dogs, and horses rode out at night, following rumors rather than evidence. Tracks in the mud, broken branches, or even animal prints were often declared proof that Jabari had passed through. No one questioned whether these signs pointed to him, or to anyone at all. Several accounts claimed brief encounters. A towering figure seen at the edge of torchlight, a silhouette disappearing into trees, gunshots fired with no body recovered. These stories always ended the same way: Jabari escaped. To those hunting him, this only reinforced the belief that he was extraordinary, even superhuman. To historians, it suggests something else entirely: panic-driven men chasing shadows in unfamiliar terrain. Importantly, there is no verified record of Jabari being wounded, captured, or even directly confronted. This absence of evidence raises uncomfortable questions. Were these posses truly encountering a single individual, or were they projecting fear onto every black figure moving outside white control? In an era when false accusations routinely led to lynching, the fact that Jabari was never caught may indicate extreme caution, intelligence, or that the legend had already outgrown the man. For black communities, the posses were a familiar terror. Night riders often used the excuse of searching for criminals to harass, intimidate, and brutalize freed people. Many families hid, fled, or stayed silent, knowing that cooperation could still end in violence. Jabari's name became a justification for collective punishment. Ironically, every failed hunt strengthened the myth. Each escape suggested invincibility. Each armed group returning empty-handed made Jabari seem less human and more legendary. By trying to capture him, the posses ensured that fear would spread farther than Jabari ever could on his own. In the end, these alleged encounters reveal a deeper truth: the South wasn't hunting a boy, it was hunting control. And control, once lost, proved far harder to capture than Jabari ever was. As Jabari's name echoed across counties and his legend grew darker, a critical divide emerged between what people believed and what could actually be proven. The problem was simple but dangerous. Nearly everything said about Jabari came from rumor, repetition, and fear, not from verified records. In a time when black lives were rarely documented with care or accuracy, myth easily replaced fact. The myths were dramatic. Jabari was said to possess unnatural strength, survive gunfire, communicate without speaking, and vanish at will. Some stories even suggested he was part of a larger group, a hidden force waiting to strike. Yet when historians examined surviving court records, arrest logs, shipping manifests, and census data from 1869, Jabari barely appears, if at all. There are no confirmed charges, no trial transcripts, no official warrants bearing his name. What does appear in records are vague descriptions: unknown Negro male, unidentified freedman, or large black youth. These labels stripped individuals of identity, making it nearly impossible to separate one person from another. Jabari may have existed as a real individual whose name was altered, misrecorded, or intentionally omitted, or he may have been an amalgamation of several men, fused into one frightening figure by rumor. This gap between myth and documentation reveals how power worked at the time. White fears were preserved in newspapers and oral stories, while black realities were ignored or erased. If Jabari harmed no one, there was little reason for officials to record him, unless they wanted to use him as a warning. For black communities, the distinction between myth and fact was understood instinctively. They knew how easily stories could be weaponized. A rumor could become a death sentence. Silence was often safer than truth. Ultimately, the Jabari mystery exists in that dangerous space where documentation failed and imagination took over. The lack of hard evidence doth mean Jabari was unreal. It means the system was never designed to record his humanity. And in that silence, fear filled the page, turning uncertainty into legend. If you want, I can continue by expanding Keynote 9 next, or finish all remaining keynotes in the same deep, cinematic style for your video. Fear does not remain still. It grows, reshapes itself, and demands a symbol. In 1869, Jabari became that symbol. What may have begun as sightings of a solitary, powerful black youth quickly evolved into something far larger, because fear in the post-Civil War South was already searching for a body to inhabit. Jabari fit the role perfectly. Each retelling of his story removed another layer of humanity. He stopped being a boy seen near woods or riverbanks and became the giant, the hunter, the menace. Details no one could confirm were repeated with certainty. His height increased, his strength became mythical, and his silence was interpreted as calculated threat. Fear didn't ask for proof, it demanded reassurance, and exaggeration provided it. Communities began speaking of Jabari as if he were everywhere at once. A noise in the trees, a shadow near a barn, a missing animal, Jabari's name was invoked. This is how legends are born, when a single explanation becomes easier than confronting many uncomfortable truths, such as social collapse, racial guilt, and loss of control. White Southerners used the legend to justify violence and vigilance. If Jabari was inhuman, then extreme measures felt reasonable. Patrols, weapons, and intimidation could be framed as self-defense. Fear transformed him into permission to terrorize black communities under the excuse of protection. At the same time, the legend took on a different meaning among the oppressed. For many black listeners, Jabari became a figure of quiet resistance. Not a criminal, but a reminder that freedom could exist beyond white oversight. His elusiveness was admired. His survival was symbolic. In whispers, he was no longer feared, he was respected. By the end of the year, Jabari no longer needed to be seen. The idea of him was enough. Fear had done its work, reshaping uncertainty into myth, and myth into legacy. Whether Jabari walked away, hid, or was absorbed into anonymity, one thing was certain: the South created the legend it could not destroy. And once fear turns a man into a legend, history stops asking who he was and starts asking what he represented. Racism was not a background element in Jabari's story. It was the engine that drove it forward. Without the deeply embedded racial ideology of 19th century America, Jabari would have been seen as unusual, perhaps misunderstood, but never transformed into a regional threat. It was racism that decided how his presence would be interpreted, reported, and remembered. In 1869, black strength was viewed as danger, black silence as guilt, and black independence as rebellion. These assumptions were not accidental. They were carefully cultivated during slavery to justify domination. After emancipation, those same beliefs did not disappear, they intensified. Jabari's size and composure directly contradicted the racist myth of black inferiority. So the narrative flipped him into its opposite, the savage brute. Language played a crucial role. Jabari was never described as skilled, or natural. He was never calm, he was cold. He was never free, he was uncontrolled. Each description stripped away individuality and replaced it with stereotype. Racism ensured that no alternative explanation was considered. He could not be a traveler, a worker, or a survivor. He had to be a threat. This racial framing also erased empathy. White audiences were encouraged to fear Jabari before knowing anything about him. His hunger, fear, or loneliness were never mentioned, only his potential for violence. Racism made it unnecessary to ask questions. Judgment came first. For black communities, this was a familiar pattern. They knew that stories like Jabari's were not about truth but control. Racism dictated who was allowed complexity and who was denied it. The narrative surrounding Jabari became a warning: any black person who appeared too powerful, too free, or too unknowable could be turned into a monster overnight. In the end, racism did more than distort Jabari's story. It preserved it in a twisted form. It ensured that history would remember the fear, not the facts. And that is perhaps the greatest injustice of all. Jabari was never allowed to be human, only symbolic. As the legend of Jabari intensified, fear began to reshape daily life across small southern communities. Panic moved faster than facts, and once it took hold, it altered behavior in visible, lasting ways. People didn't just talk about Jabari, they reacted to him, even when they had never seen him. White families reported locking doors earlier, posting armed guards at night, and avoiding travel through wooded areas. Church gatherings and social events were cancelled or shortened. Parents warned children not to wander, invoking Jabari's name like a cautionary tale. The fear became communal, passed from neighbor to neighbor until anxiety felt like common sense. Some families claimed to relocate temporarily, moving closer to towns or more heavily populated areas for safety. While official records rarely cite Jabari by name, letters and oral histories reference the disturbances, the giant Negro rumors, or the trouble in the woods. These vague phrases suggest a collective unease rather than a specific incident, fear without a clear cause. For Black communities, the consequences were far more severe. Increased panic meant increased scrutiny. Freed families were questioned, watched, and blamed. Entire settlements were accused of hiding Jabari, leading some to flee preemptively, moving north or deeper into rural areas to avoid confrontation. Migration, in this sense, was not opportunity, it was escape. Stories spread of people abandoning cabins overnight, leaving behind tools and belongings. Whether all these accounts are factual matters less than their impact. Fear disrupted stability. It fractured communities already struggling to rebuild after slavery. In time, these migration stories blended into the legend itself. Jabari was said to drive people away without ever appearing, a figure so powerful that his presence alone altered geography. Towns grew quieter. Roads changed. Silence followed. This phase of the legend reveals its true cost. Jabari did not need to attack anyone to leave a mark. Fear alone displaced lives, reinforced racial divisions, and turned rumor into movement. And once people began to move because of a story, the story became real, no matter what the truth had been. By late 1869, Jabari was no longer just a person, or even a legend. He had become a symbol, absorbing the collective anxiety of a South struggling to exist without slavery. Every unresolved fear, every lost certainty, and every threatened hierarchy seemed to find its shape in his name. The end of slavery created questions white Southern society did not want to answer. Who was in control now? Who belonged on the land? What did freedom actually look like? Jabari represented the most terrifying answer to all three. A Black individual who moved freely, owed nothing, and could not be accounted for. He was proof that the old system had failed completely. Unlike political debates or laws, Jabari's story was emotional. It bypassed logic and went straight to instinct. He symbolized the fear that Black freedom was not just legal, but physical, powerful, and irreversible. For many whites, this fear manifested as paranoia. If one Jabari existed, how many more might follow? At the same time, Jabari symbolized hope in quieter spaces. To those who had endured bondage, he represented something rare, a Black figure who survived outside white control and left no paper trail to be exploited. His mystery was not weakness, it was protection. Not being known meant not being owned. This dual symbolism is what kept the story alive. To one side, Jabari was a warning of chaos. To the other, he was evidence that freedom could exist beyond supervision. He carried both meanings without ever speaking. In the end, Jabari's greatest impact was not fear, but exposure. He exposed how fragile the post-slavery order truly was. A single unknown figure was enough to unravel confidence, disrupt communities, and ignite racial hysteria. That is the power of a symbol, and that is why Jabari could never be fully erased. Just as suddenly as Jabari entered Southern consciousness, he vanished. After months of rumors, sightings, and fear-driven pursuit, reports of the giant hunter boy began to fade. Newspapers stopped mentioning him. Posses disbanded. Communities moved on uneasy but quiet. No capture was announced. No body was found. There was no resolution, only absence. This disappearance only deepened the mystery. Some claimed Jabari retreated deeper into the wilderness, beyond roads and settlements, where no one dared follow. Others believed he escaped northward, blending into freed communities or crossing borders, where his legend held no power. A darker theory suggested he was killed in secret, his death deliberately unrecorded to avoid scrutiny or unrest. But like everything else in his story, no evidence confirmed any version. What is striking is how quickly official attention disappeared. In an era obsessed with tracking and punishing black movement, the lack of follow-up is suspicious. It suggests that Jabari was either never truly a single target, or that acknowledging the truth no longer served those in power. Silence became convenient. For black communities, his disappearance was interpreted cautiously. Some believed it meant safety, that whatever danger followed Jabari's name had passed. Others feared it meant something worse had happened, something never meant to be spoken aloud. In a time when black deaths were routinely ignored, silence often carried its own message. Over time, the absence became part of the legend. Jabari didn't end, he evaporated. No ending meant no closure. And without closure, stories survive. His disappearance turned him from a living threat into an eternal question. Perhaps that was his final act of resistance. In leaving no trace, Jabari denied history the power to define his fate. And in doing so, he ensured that the mystery would outlive the fear that created it. History did not forget Jabari by accident, it let him disappear on purpose. Once the fear subsided and Reconstruction hardened into new systems of control, Jabari's story became inconvenient. He no longer served the needs of those who had shaped the narrative. A free, elusive black figure who was never captured, never proven guilty, and never controlled did not fit the version of order the South wanted to restore. Records from the era reveal a pattern. Stories that threatened the myth of white dominance were either rewritten or quietly abandoned. Jabari was dangerous not because of what he did, but because of what he represented, a failure of surveillance, authority, and racial hierarchy. Erasing his name was easier than explaining why he could not be contained. There was also fear of contradiction. If Jabari was real and harmless, then the panic, posses, and violence directed at black communities would be exposed as unjustified. Silence protected reputations. It allowed newspapers, officials, and landowners to move forward without accountability. For black communities, erasure was nothing new. Their stories were rarely archived, rarely validated, and often dismissed as folklore. Jabari's legacy survived only in fragments, whispers, half-remembered warnings, and oral histories passed quietly between generations. These stories were not written down because writing invited danger. In time, history books focused on laws, battles, and politicians, leaving no space for figures like Jabari, those who existed in the margins, but revealed the truth more clearly than any document. His absence from official history is itself evidence of how power chooses memory. Jabari's name was erased because it challenged control. Yet erasure is never complete. The fact that his story can still be told today proves that silence failed. History may have tried to bury Jabari, but mysteries, especially those born of injustice, always find a way to rise again.